All right.
I'm gonna do a quick introduction. Thank you everybody for taking time out. I'm Robin Zickman with Decoding Dyslexia Idaho, and this is part 2 of our 2-part Lunch and Learn series that we've partnered with the Children's Therapy Place. Carly, do you feel like we want to do another quick introduction about you and what you offer in the community?
Sure. So Children's Therapy Place, so we offer pediatric therapy. And so we do speech and language therapy, we do mental health counseling, physical therapy, occupational therapy, and behavioral intervention. And so with that, this is our 20th year. And so we have been offering that to kiddos in Idaho since 2001.
Wonderful. And Decoding Dyslexia is a nonprofit here in the state of Idaho. Every state has a chapter, and our role is to bring awareness to dyslexia. 1 in 5 of our children are dyslexic, and better understanding of what dyslexia is, and just advocate, educate, and ultimately to pass dyslexia legislation. Idaho is now the only state that has not passed dyslexia legislation, so we have a group that's working hard to move towards that, to require early screening and teacher training. So reach out to us for anything dyslexia related. We are here to support the state of Idaho. I want to introduce today's speaker. She's dear to my heart because she has taken it upon herself to be a life learner. Her background is she's an SLP. And I'm just going to read a little bit and try not to botch it up this time. Kirsten Lewis, she earned her bachelor's degree from Santa Clara University. She graduated from the University of Utah with a master's in speech language pathology in 2009. She began her career in adult rehabilitation, addressing neurological disorders and swallowing disorders. After moving to Idaho in 2012, Kirsten transitioned to pediatric outpatient rehabilitation. She soon began to recognize that children with verbal speech and language disorders were also demonstrating difficulties learning to read and write. She began to investigate this and engaged in extensive study to learn more about written language disorders, including dyslexia. She now specializes in the prevention, early intervention, and remediation of children with written language disorders. She became certified as a structured literacy dyslexic specialist through the Center for Effective Reading Instruction and through IDA, the International Dyslexia Association. She's also the founder and has launched her own private practice here in Idaho. She owns Reach the Summit Literacy. Kirsten, thanks for being with us today.
Absolutely.
For your presentation.
Yeah.
I will be managing the chat box, so feel free to post questions, and when there's a good time for a break, we will address those questions and have some interaction.
Perfect. Thank you, Robin. And let me just ask, I never know what I see on my screen and what you guys see on yours. Do you see the Zoom faces, or is it just the presentation?
I have us. Are you talking about the attendees?
Yeah.
I have us on the side. I think it's how each individual has set their Zoom screen up for viewing.
Okay, but if I move mine around like this, can you see that at all?
I see your mouse.
You see my mouse, but okay. I'm moving all your faces around just.
And I see your face, but no, you're not.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that if I have that up, it's not overlapping and distracting on your end from any of the slide points. So perfect. All right. Well, I have titled this presentation, Diagnosis Dyslexia, Now What? I've been really excited to give this presentation for a long time because I think that's often the biggest question is I've either suspected my child has dyslexia or I've recently been diagnosed with dyslexia and I don't know what to do about it. So I think it's really important that we get this information out to parents so that they have at least awareness as far as some of the pieces and steps that go into the road that you have before you that can help you know what your waypoints are and what some of the pieces that really should be considered and implemented need to be. So I love this picture. I was I think it's the Forrest Gump Road, but I was hoping it'd be a little bit more windy because unfortunately the road for parents of children with dyslexia a is not a straight road, but it is a long road. It does have some beautiful scenery, but it also can be barren at times. So I think this picture represents a lot, and I just love Forrest Gump coming up here and making his determination, because that's where everyone comes when they have a diagnosis of dyslexia. All right. So dyslexia is one diagnosis that our kiddos with some of these difficulties often receive. There can also be a number of other diagnoses that either mask the dyslexia diagnosis, are more appropriate than the dyslexia diagnosis, or also that accompany the diagnosis of dyslexia. And I made a list here. These are a lot of diagnoses that you may see or that you may run into along your journey. Again, dyslexia being one of them. Specific learning impairment is often the term that's used in the schools to say that there is difficulty with reading or writing. Dyslexia falls under the umbrella of specific learning impairment, and it is often not called out in the school system because it's either not recognized within the school, they don't know how to address dyslexia specifically. And one other piece to that is that specific learning impairment related to reading, writing, or math, those are specific criteria within the IDEA terminology. And in order to qualify, your child has to have a diagnosis under those lines. And so again, that's the umbrella term, but dyslexia does fit very solidly under there. And we do hope and wish that that would get called out a little bit more specifically so that kiddos can get the best remediation that's specific to what they're actually experiencing. Because again, that umbrella is big, it's wide, there's a lot that fits under it. A few other diagnoses that often go hand in hand, or that can just be adjoining diagnosis that run up as a result of some of these other difficulties, or can stand alone, or dysgraphia. That plays in more into the written language and the actual expression of written language. So the ability to write effectively, get handwriting in place, get spelling in place, and have all of those pieces line up more specific to writing as opposed to reading. There is a pretty solid overlap between dyslexia and dysgraphia. Sometimes it can be hard to really weed out because it's such a gray area that kind of brings those together. Dyscalculia is another diagnosis, and that is specific to math. And so being able to do math computations, understand the symbols of math is what some of the pieces that make up dyscalculia. And sometimes that can be an adjoining diagnosis that these kiddos struggle with. Attention deficit disorder is sometimes it very often accompanies that dyslexia. Sometimes it's truly because the children do have difficulties with attention. Other times it's because they appear to, because the tasks are so challenging that they're being asked to do that they simply can't focus. So that can be a tricky one to really weed out of if there's truly a misbalance in the chemical makeup of the brain that lead to difficulties with attention, or if they're having trouble attending because of the content and the way that it's being delivered. Executive functioning deficits often tie in as well. That is, executive functioning really makes up how we approach a task, plan for a task, and carry out a task. So it's task initiation, it's goal planning, goal setting, following the steps that are required, and finishing a task to completion, and then reviewing your work or whatever you've done to make sure that you've done it effectively. There's so many tasks and pieces and steps that go into the reading process that it's not uncommon for kids to have difficulties with executive functioning when they have a dyslexia diagnosis as well. Speech and language disorder is really prevalent in our kiddos with dyslexia. It can often be an early factor that we see where they either have difficulties with speech pronunciation and articulation, or they have difficulties with the receptive or expressive language pieces. And that can be really helpful for some of our early recognition and early intervention to recognize some of those kiddos. Central auditory processing disorder is the auditory side of things. It's not hearing. Hearing acuity is okay. The signal is getting into the ear. The children are able to hear okay. It's once that signal gets into the brain. It's what the brain does with what comes to it. And there's a lot, again, some disconnect and also some overlap between what's called CAPD, or central auditory processing disorder, and dyslexia. Often kiddos who go in for CAPD evaluations have concerns with reading, and that's expressed as one of those concerns. Visual disturbances also can play a part. Convergence insufficiency is one diagnosis that can play in with visual disturbances. But again, there's some muddy ground there where it has to truly be recognized that it's specifically a visual deficit. Dyslexia is not a visual deficit. Dyslexia is a deficit in the language processing and the language and sound recognition of words. It has nothing to do with the eyes. It has nothing to do with how the eyes interpret the signal of what they see. So again, there can be some of that overlap where it really gets muddy and hard to really pinpoint or piece out. But both of these are true diagnoses, and it has to really be worked through to determine which is actually contributing. Sometimes too, with convergence insufficiency, it can be a disorder of the eyes, and the eyes have a problem once that's corrected. And because of the difficulty, it can lead to children having difficulty learning some of the pieces that they need to learn because they're not seeing it appropriately. Once that's corrected and they see it appropriately, then they can move on to working on some of the language pieces. So again, something that's really necessary to pinpoint and determine what the underlying factor is so that it can be addressed most effectively. Now, I often get the question of, is receiving a diagnosis important? I don't want my child labeled. Yes, a diagnosis is important. It's important for a number of reasons. Labeling is a tricky thing, and it can be a really emotional piece. But the label can really stand to hold a lot of ground, most especially with the access to services and the access to support. If your child doesn't have a label, meet eligibility criteria, then they're not going to qualify for services within the school. It can be harder to get insurance to cover or support some of the difficulties that you're seeing if you're receiving support from an outpatient clinic or from a community support. And it can really help give you information. If you don't have a diagnosis, it's hard to really receive the information. Again, you see this list out here, and there's all these difficulties. There's a lot of overlap with each of them. But when it comes down to it, the underlying piece behind each of them is different, and how you might address it. There can be some very strong similarities in how it's addressed, but there's also some very significant differences. Now, is it important to have a diagnosis of dyslexia? I truly believe that it is. Again, dyslexia falls under the umbrella of specific learning impairment. So it is being captured within our schools with a title, with a diagnosis that does receive eligibility and support. The problem is that the way that you address a child with dyslexia can be very different than the way that you might address a child with significant language disabilities that in turn have difficulty comprehending the information that they hear and read. So but both of those would fit very nicely under that umbrella to some extent. So we want to make sure that we're capturing accurately what is being determined so that we can accurately provide the support and the necessary remediation and accommodations that child might specifically need. Now, along this road of dyslexia, we really want to make sure that we're recruiting support. It's a long road, it's a challenging road, and doing it ourselves is not going to be effective. There are three main areas for support that would involve the school, the community, and home. If we can tie and connect all of these pieces, we're going to have a much better road and an easier path to follow. So that's kind of the basis for my talk today, is just to go through each of these pieces, give you at least a quick overview. I don't want to spend a lot of time on some of these components because I really want to make sure we get into what you can do at home so that you feel empowered and able to engage and do something really proactive. So that's where the bulk of our time is going to be spent today, but I want to make sure we talk about the school and the community aspects. So you at least have an awareness, you know what's out there and available. And then with each page, I did provide some additional resources. So you can look at some articles that go pretty specifically into the topic to explain it more so than I have time to do today. Now, this is a busy page and I apologize. But in terms of the school aspect, there are two primary routes that are taken. There's the route of the individualized education plan, which is also called the IEP. There's also the 504 plan. These are different for a variety of reasons. They were established under two different laws. IDEA is actually a federal special education law, and it was constructed for children who have learning disabilities. Section 504 is a part of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So that is a federal law that was put into place to stop the discrimination against people with disabilities. So we're really looking at disability versus and rehabilitation versus special education. So they come from two different places. So they're addressing two different things, essentially, again, overlap, but they came about for different reasons and purposes, and they are really set to accomplish different purposes. The requirements for IEPs are that the child have one or more of the set 13 disabilities that IDEA lists. So again, that specific learning impairment is one of those, but they have to fall within one of those 13 categories. Whereas a 504 plan, it's much less restrictive. They do have to have a disability that's recognized, but it does not have to be one of those specific 13. So because there is a little bit more flexibility, it can often be a little bit easier to qualify for. Now, the other piece to both of these is that the disability must affect the child's educational performance and their ability to learn and benefit from the general education curriculum. And so the child must, for an IEP, the child must require specialized instruction in order to make progress in school. For a 504 plan, the child will require some accommodations or supports in order to still be successful within the general education. And so that's kind of the biggest breakdown, is that with an IEP, your child receives special services. They might receive special education. They might receive speech and language intervention or a number of other special services, and then accommodations and supports in place of that. The 504 does not provide many of those supports. A child will more specifically receive accommodations and modifications so that they can be successful in the location that they are generally in for general curriculum. An IEP is a formal written document that sets the learning goals and describes the services that the school will provide. A 504 is not a standard plan, and it does not have to be a written document. It just kind of depends on the district and the school and how they approach it. I would recommend that it's a written plan and that it becomes a formal document so that you have a trail to follow, you have a plan in place, and so that all of that information follows your child throughout their school, throughout all of their school years and through their transitions, so that they continue to receive those accommodations and support. I believe any of them that I've seen in Idaho, I believe it is a written document, but again, it's not mandated by law like the IEP is. So something to just kind of ensure as you go through the process. And again, the goal of a 504 is really to outline specific accommodations, modifications, and supports, as opposed to giving them qualification for services. Now, there's so much more to this. There's so much more involved, and the steps that are helpful and required to go through this process are really necessary to be laid out, but I don't have time for that within the scope of this presentation. I did outline 4 different websites and articles here that give a really great article to discuss each of those pieces, with discussing the differences between an IEP and a 504, and then the steps that are beneficial and required to go through the process of achieving both. So I really recommend that you kind of piece through those at your convenience. In terms of services that are often granted and helpful for a child with dyslexia, they often include special education, to a degree. The amount of time and support within that can be highly variable, as with each of these services. Speech and language therapy can often be helpful, especially if there's a speech therapist that's really has a significant background in literacy as well. Occupational therapy can be really helpful for some of the handwriting, some of the visual pieces that might go into it. I apologize because through all of this, I'm going to gloss over some of this. I'm not going to talk about all the specifics, all of the pieces that are helpful. So if I'm leaving anything out, I do apologize, but counseling support can also be helpful. Sometimes some of these kiddos end up with mental health difficulties as a result of their struggles, and the counseling component can be a benefit and can be included. And then extended school year services so that they get remediation and support outside of the typical school year. Now, in terms of accommodations, these are the accommodations. It's a subset of accommodations that I have found to be some of the most helpful, and some, at least, I mean, accommodations can span so wide. So, but I think that these are all worth considering and all worth having put into a plan if the parents and the school feel as though they'd be helpful. What I really do is I really suggest that parents look through the lists of accommodations. You mark up the ones that you see and the ones that you feel like would be helpful. Again, it can be such a wide list. Not every child benefits from all of these pieces, but mark up the ones you feel like it would be helpful, the ones you're not sure about, and those that you feel like wouldn't be helpful. Bring that in with you to the IEP meeting and really demand and provide an expectation that those pieces are going to be addressed in your child's plan. Make a case and really state the importance for the IEP team. But those include extra time for tests and assignments, help with reading written questions on a test, allowing the child the ability to complete the work or take tests in a room with minimal noise or distractions, allowing a child to dictate stories or thoughts to be written by an adult. That's often more helpful with spelling difficulties or with dysgraphia, but it also plays a large part in dyslexia as well. Providing classroom handouts and copies of notes, providing materials that promote visualization, such as figures, graph, and illustrations, so that children can rely on visual components in addition to print, so that they can make use of all of the pieces that play into their systems and how they make sense of information. I really support the idea that children should not be required to read aloud in front of the class. This can lead to significant anxiety and some social disruption. And so I do promote that if that's a task that the teacher feels is important and should be required, that they allow the child to read outside of the classroom to a familiar adult away from the class in just a one-on-one setting. Reviewing assignments with the child to ensure that they understand what's expected. Often our instructions are printed and they're written, and the child doesn't understand isn't capable of reading the instructions to the full extent. So they don't always know what's expected of them down the line, even if it's picture-based once they get into the work. We don't always think about how much we use print and how debilitating that can be for some of our children with dyslexia. Providing a list of books to be read as soon as possible so that parents can obtain audiobooks. I'll talk a little bit later about audiobooks and kind of the benefits behind those. Providing alternative testing forms. So instead of a written test with multiple choice answers, having the child do a short essay or an oral report where it can be, instead of having to read a lot of the information, they can put it down in their terms or in their ways, allowing them to show it in pictures or in other terms as opposed to writing it out completely, or performing and presenting projects so that some of the written piece is taken out of there. When written work is graded, it should be graded on content rather than on the form, especially the spelling, because spelling is often a significant piece in the dyslexia picture, and it's a challenge for these kiddos. So if they're constantly getting graded on their spelling, they're not going to be successful. But we can grade their work based on what they've put down and what they intend, as opposed to how they're spelling it. And if they are receiving grades for spelling, it should only be on words that have been given with direct instruction. Corrective feedback is really necessary immediately after the completion of a practice spelling test so that children can understand their difficulties, see where their errors are, and understand why and how they made those errors and what needs to be done instead. Again, here only expecting the child to spell accurately the words that were included as part of an explicit instruction. And then similar to up above, really making sure that you're combining written and verbal information as well as visual information as often as possible, so that kiddos can utilize all of their strengths to help support their weaknesses. Assistive technology is a really big component here too. Unfortunately, dyslexia is not amenable to a cure. We're not going to cure dyslexia. But we can make really significant gains and improvements. They say that a child with dyslexia is going to continue to struggle throughout their life. They may not struggle significantly. They may just notice things here and there as they get older, kind of depending on the road that they've had prior. But it's not something that we can completely overcome and fix. So what we really need to do is have a multiple tiered intervention. We don't just want to expect that we're gonna fix the brain and rewire and make it so that all of a sudden this isn't an issue for them, because it's not reasonable and realistic. We can make it significantly less of a struggle. We can make them significantly more successful with print and utilizing it, but they might still run into times where they have a breakdown, and we want to make sure that they're supported in those moments. And so what we want to do is we want to make sure that they're set up with intervention services, as I discussed before, with accommodations so that there are ways for them to kind of adjust and adapt to their environment. Now, that isn't applicable across the lifespan. So it's not just in K through 12 schooling that this is appropriate. It's also appropriate in college and at that level. And there are support services to support these kiddos at that level so they can be successful in the college scenario, but also in workplace environments. It's not unreasonable to ask a manager to make some accommodations and some adjustments so that an adult can be successful in this environment. Sometimes it can make it so that they're a much better worker than some of their other employees that have never been down this road. So they're all, accommodations are always an opportunity and are always realistic. The other piece, though, is the assistive technology. We all have our watches, we all have our calculators, we all have our calendars. That is all assistive technology. I couldn't go a day without my calendar. That's the only way that I make it day to day. I don't memorize everything that I have to do throughout the day. I don't have my list down in my head. I have a tool that I rely on, that I go to, whether it's in my phone or on my desktop or on my watch or whatever it may be, that helps me and assists me in getting through my day and making sure that I'm on time and I know what to expect and that I'm set up. That is a very real possibility for all of these kids, and it shouldn't be something that's just provided to them in one scenario or another or taken away from them. So each of these opportunities here are something that can be very beneficial when kids know how to use these tools and they access them and they take them with them. It's something that they can use in a variety of environments. And so it needs to be there, readily available, and it needs to be taught so that they can understand how to use it, when to use it, and why it's important that they use it. So a few of those options that are more specific to the dyslexic population: speech to text. So essentially what that is just what it says. You or the child speaks and it puts it into text. We have a lot of software now that is super capable of this. Microsoft has been amazing in that they have now integrated into all of their products. And so you might notice on your Word desktop or on OneNote or PowerPoint or whatever it is that you use, a dictate button. All you do is you push that and you talk, and it puts down your train of thought onto the page. The challenge with this is that it's not always accurate, and you have to go through and you have to do some editing afterwards. So that's, again, where the instruction and the training comes into play. So we can't just put it in front of a child and say, here's the magic button, you push it and it's going to do exactly what you need to do. But we can get them set up so they have a tool to make the struggle a lot less, help it so that they're more successful in what they're trying to do, and take away some of the pieces that are barriers to them right now. Text to speech is another fantastic tool where essentially it's taking text or the written word and it's converting it into speech. We have a lot of different programs now. Some of them are computerized voices, which kiddos tend not to get quite as motivated by, but it's still a really fantastic option. But there's also natural voices and voices that have where the text has been read from a person, and those are pretty phenomenal. So this allows where they don't have to do the work to pull the word off the page. They can take it and they can understand it and utilize and have access to something that they didn't have great access to before. Read, write, and study suites are where it's basically, where it's pulling more of these tools together into one product. There are a lot of individual products out there where it's a text-to-speech app or it's a button on one component that'll allow for this. But these read, write, and study suites are pretty phenomenal in that they kind of give all the pieces that might be helpful. Read and write for Google. I guess it's not for Google. It's really well supported on the Google platform, but Read and Write is an extension that is an example of one of these where they have features that will do text to speech, speech to text, and also some highlighting functions, dictionaries, different ways that you can incorporate some of those study pieces as well. And these aren't tools that are only for kiddos with dyslexia or with a significant debilitating disability. These can be phenomenal for every kid in the classroom. And if we can get teachers to recognize that and incorporate these into the classroom, then the kiddo with dyslexia who needs to rely on this won't feel singled out, but they can be really helpful. I downloaded Read and Write onto my computer and I was like, wow, if I would have had this while I was going through graduate school, that would have made my training a whole lot easier. And so they can really help to incorporate some of these skills and build skills among all children. And especially as we're getting into this technological age where it's at our fingertips, why not? Audiobooks are a subset of text to speech. What I love about audiobooks is that often you ask parents who have a child diagnosed with dyslexia, and one of the really key questions is, now, if it were to be read to them, would they understand it? You really want to try and piece out, is it a comprehension piece that if they were to just hear it, would they have difficulty or not? Most often kiddos with dyslexia wouldn't have any trouble understanding if it were read to them or if they were to hear it. Their trouble is in pulling the word off the page. And in that struggle of pulling it off the page, it limits them down the line to where the comprehension becomes a struggle as well. So audiobooks can be phenomenal because often our kiddos run into subsequent deficits that wouldn't be necessary otherwise. So they run into limited vocabulary. They run into not always accessing the same curriculum content that their grade level peers are experiencing. And they run into reduced language exposure. They don't always have the same understanding of some of the language constructs. The reason behind this isn't because their language is disrupted. It's because, I should say, their verbal language. It's because they don't always have the same access to the content. And so if we can have the content read to them and given them to them, whether it's a chapter book, whether it's a textbook, a book of high interest to them that they just wouldn't be able to read on their own, if we can give that to them, then they have the same access and exposure to grade level vocabulary, grade level content, concepts that they should be learning and understanding, all things that they're very capable of learning and understanding and taking in. They just aren't getting it because they don't have the same access, because they can't read the word off the page in the same capacity that their peers can. So audiobooks are a real phenomenal piece of assistive technology that provides that, and it just gives them that access that they didn't have otherwise. Spell check is great. It has its limitations. You have to spell closely enough for it to be caught and picked up. Word prediction, like we have on our phones, it's also implemented into a variety of programs, can also be helpful, because if they can get the first couple letters, or if they can get a couple words down on the page, it can help them pull in the word that they're looking for in some of their writing assignments. Reading pens like the C pen can be really helpful. It can be helpful in a number of ways, but again, we want to show them when, why, and how to use it. Some kids, it's helpful for them to use in a string of text. others. It's just helpful for them to use when they run into a word they really don't know and they can't work out. But it allows them to move through that point of either having to guess and maybe guess inappropriately, or having to struggle and skip it and then not have a missing gap. But it allows for a lot of opportunities. And then note-taking tools. So there can be a lot of note-taking tools that can really help, especially as kiddos get into higher grade levels, that can help them keep up and maintain. The Live Scribe pen is one of those, and that's phenomenal because kiddos use a special pen, they write on special paper. If they can't write the word or they can't keep up with the lecture, all they have to do is put something on the page. And what the pen does is it follows along the lecture and it records it. When you go back, if you want to push on the page, if you write a star or if you write a dot because you don't know the word or you can't follow along and keep up with your note taking, you can push on that and it will bring you to that direct point in the lecture or the instruction. And then a child can listen from that point on to kind of fill in any gaps they might be missing. So whole variety, super cool what technology can offer us. And there's no reason why we shouldn't be utilizing it and incorporating it. And by doing that, it helps round out our approach so that kiddos can be more successful across more environments and more scenarios. Here is a resource I really like. It is a website, an AT toolkit that one of our Decoding Dyslexia members sent along, and it's phenomenal. It really has them tools broken down into a variety of different categories. It lists out specific manufacturers and products and gives you it has basically the information you want or need right there at your fingertips. So I really love this website. So now if we look into the community, there's a variety of professionals in the community that can help support our kiddos. And they do so from a variety of perspectives. Often the perspectives overlap and integrate, but everyone kind of has their specialization in their realm from how they come to this. And so, it often takes a team. And it often takes the perspectives and the experience and knowledge from a variety of professionals to really get the ultimate in assessment, as well as the ultimate in remediation instruction and benefit moving forward. So I just list out here some of the titles that you might see moving forward in your journey. I put a list here. This is from the Decoding Dyslexia website. We have a really fantastic resource page of some of the resources that we have available that we've found that specifically address dyslexia, as well as just a great array of other resources along this website. So I really encourage you to spend some time on the Decoding Dyslexia Idaho website. Now at home, some of the things that you can address at home. And before I jump into home, let me just take a break. Robin, have there been any questions? Sorry, my wheels have been spinning and I forgot to stop and ask.
No worries. No questions are posted in the
Perfect.
chat box, but if anybody wants to unmute themselves, if you have a question. Okie doke.
Perfect. And we'll have some time at the end, I hope, for questions as well. So, and this is just a list of really general recommendations I make for home. I'm going to give you much more specific pieces in a moment, but reading together aloud regularly with your child is a big one. But that can be without its two-prong. Kiddos are never too old to be read to. Again, we want to continue to get exposure to content, to language skills, to vocabulary. So reading out loud to your child a book that they would like to read, but might be too challenging for them to read is fantastic. But you also want to have your child read aloud to you. We often get to a point in school where they're given reading time and they're asked to read, but the expectation is that they're reading silently and quietly toward themselves. And we have no glimpse and perspective at that point of how they're doing, what they're struggling on, and where the breakdowns happen. So reading aloud together is fantastic. And scheduling time, I usually recommend 20 to 30 minutes a day, 3 to 4 days a week at a minimum. But having your child read out loud to you so that you can see, you can help, and you can support them in the moments where they are having some struggles. But again, it also gives you perspective and helps you understand where and why and how they're struggling so that you can, so that you have a better understanding of what's going on. Encourage your child to read books of high interest for pleasure. I think that's one thing that our kiddos often miss out on is the ability to read for pleasure because it's a challenge and it's not pleasurable. So going to the library, letting them pick out a book. Graphic novels are phenomenal because they give a lot of pictures and visual support, but they also give the printed word so kids can do a lot of the back and forth to still work with the printed word, but also have supportive pictures as they're going through it. So no book should be off limits. No child should be told that they can't read a certain book. Allow them to read and engage with whatever book they are interested in. If it's a book that's above their reading level, that's when you step in and that's where you read it to them. So again, they can still hear what they want to hear. They can still engage in the story that their best friend might be reading and enjoying. So they have a point of conversation. They can talk about the characters. They can talk about the storyline, but they don't have to be required to pull the word off their page like their friend is able to do. Reinforcing what is being learned at school by practicing reading school-based materials aloud. It can just be another good catalyst to having some of that read aloud material, but also giving you a little bit more of a glimpse into what's happening at school and what they're doing. Obtain a second copy of the book. So that way you have a book to hold, they have a book to hold. The same book, you're following along together. It makes it easier to take turns and bounce back and forth who's reading. It also helps you understand when they've read a word that is not correct. And that way you don't have to be looking over their shoulder and watching the print to make sure that it's all going well. Request a list of books early in the school year so that you can obtain any audiobooks. Sometimes it does take time to find the specific book you might need, and so requesting early can help. Utilize your local library. There's so many resources at the library, also on their websites. And so I really encourage you, all you need is a library card. You go onto their websites and they have a lot of audiobooks just on the websites as well. So you often don't have to purchase a membership for some of these as well. Having a child use their finger to track while they're reading can be really helpful. It can keep them on target. It can help them to see what they're doing, to spend a little bit more time so that they're guiding and engaging, and to work through pieces if it's not coming together as they need it to. Encourage your child to sound out a word. Don't ever encourage them to guess. Talking about new words or concepts that come across in a story helps to build language, vocabulary, and curricular content. Talking about the characters, events, and content and relate them to your child's experience. We learn best if we can relate something we learned to our own experience. Memorization is not helpful. It's not successful. But if we can grasp it based on something we already know, we're so much more successful. Review class handouts and assignments to make sure your child understands what's expected. Again, a lot of those instructions are print. And so you want to make sure that they're understanding, and proofread their work, help them, give them feedback and corrections. Okay, here's a fun part. So some strategies that you can address at home. Phonemic awareness is one of my number one pieces I want to make sure a child has. This is our foundation, and it's what we build everything off of to gain an effective reader. I love the idea of having a pipe cleaner with beads on it. If any of you have watched, I gave a presentation a couple of weeks ago through Decoding Dyslexia Idaho, and just talked about this, showed and explained it. But a pipe cleaner with 5 beads on it is a fantastic tool that every parent can make and have at home. The 3 pieces of phonemic awareness that are most helpful to address with this and to make sure that are set and solid before you move on to advanced pieces of phonological awareness are isolation, which is being able to take a word and isolate a given sound within it, whether it's the first sound, the last sound, the middle sound, just having a child understand what sound plays into the word. Blending is where you give the child sounds. Say, for example, I gave you the sounds a, b, it. Put those sounds together, and if you can string it all together, you'd understand the words rabbit. That's the kind of thing we want to do with our kiddos. We want them to hear sounds and see how they would come together to make a word. We have to do that when we read. We sound it out, we get all the sounds, but we don't have the concept of the word yet. If we can string it all together, then we can pull together and figure out what the word is. Segmenting is the opposite, and segmenting applies a little bit more to spelling. But segmenting is where you're given a word and then you break it up into all the individual sounds. So, for example, here is my fun little simulation with beads on a pipe cleaner. So say our word is, I'm going to take let's take the word cart. No, actually, so R is 2 letters, it's 1 sound. So AR, so I'm not going to take that one. It's a little bit trickier. I want to do something that's really straightforward so that we just understand this really well without diving into all these specifics, because that's what your specialist in your support is there for, to help you understand all those intricacies. But let's take the word dog. So we take the word dog. What we want to do is we want to pull our sounds apart. The beads represent all the pieces that can go in to make up a whole. So if we have the beads all together, like we do in this picture, we'll see that they all come together, and that's our word. But what we can do is we can piece apart all the individual pieces of that word to understand what goes into it and makes it up. So what we could do here is we could say, okay, our word's dog. I want you to pull apart a bead for every sound that you hear in that. What sounds do you hear in the word dog? D, ah, g. And there we can see, it's very visual here, that we can see, okay, there are 3 sounds in the word dog. You just pulled apart 3 pieces. 1, 2, 3. There's your 3 sounds. You heard a d, you heard an ah, and you heard a g. Those all go in to make up the sound. Now, if we were to do the opposite and do the blending activity, like I told you, I'm going to give you 5 sounds. We can string them all apart, hear what we have something tactile to hold and feel and move. And then we can figure out what the word is by piecing it all together. So our sounds are a, b, I, t. Okay, your sounds have all moved to this side. They're all together again. They've created the word. What's your word? Rabbit. So that's how I really like to use the beads on the pipe cleaner. But what we can also do is hold this and say, okay, your word is peace. What's the first sound that you hear? Let's slide it off. There you go. So there's a lot of different ways you can play with this. You can feel it out, you can move it, but it gives kiddos that multisensory component that is so beneficial. They can see it, they can feel it, they can experience it. They can do so much more than just having to grasp it all inside their head and inside the air and environment. So if anyone has any questions, if anyone wants any more specifically, I can give my email address. We can talk about this more, but again, for the sake of today, it's just a quick demo. Another piece that I really want to explain is letter reversals, that infamous B, D, P, and Q. They're rough. And if that's one thing that parents can do at home, you can work on, that you can help make a significant impact. Now, letter reversals are not, they're not a defining characteristic of dyslexia. Not every child with dyslexia experiences letter reversals. It's not criteria for a diagnosis, but it happens quite frequently. And so it's something that you want to be aware of and have some tools in your toolbox. So I made this, I'm super excited about it. It's not the most appealing with these wonderful faces. I was hoping there was something more lipstick wise, but anyhow, these were the best pictures that gave the best impression. So as you can see here, B, D, P, and Q, if you were to take a mirror image, or you're to switch them around, flip them, anything you do, they would make something else, something different along that set, and it would all be real. And that's the problem, is that no matter how you flip it or how you interpret it, it's real and it has meaning and it plays into our sound system. So that's where this is just so unfair to our kiddos. But if we can figure out a way to conceptualize this, make it more fair, and make sense of it based on what we have access to, then we can be more successful. There's a ton of tricks out there. Some of them, I've tried a bunch of them with a bunch of different kids, and some of them I found to be more helpful with some kiddos than the others. But these are what I've found to be the most successful, because often our kiddos with dyslexia have difficulty with working memory. Memory is not their strong suit, so they have to memorize something or memorize a catchy little saying. It's not always going to stand true and hold on for them when they need it most. But with these activities, it's something they always have access to, they can always think towards. So I start with B and D because that's most often and most common. So what I do is I tell kiddos, I say, I want you to make this sound with me. I want you to watch my mouth, and I want you to feel within your mouth what you're doing. So I want you guys to all kind of do it along, play with me along with it, because the more that you feel and experience, the more you can kind of help grasp it yourself. But so as we can see here, when you make a B, you make a B. As you can see, I'm gonna get super close to you, nice and personal. I want you to look at my mouth, really look at what it looks like. It looks like a line. We push our lips together, we make a straight line with our lips. What does the letter B start with? A line. So we make the sound, bah. We make a line, and then we open it up. Then we take the sound D, and we make the sound D. We're gonna do the same thing. So we're gonna do duh. I want you to look at my mouth. I want you to feel it. So duh. You never see my mouth close. We can't close our mouth to make a D sound. So I tell kiddos it's not super round. It doesn't look like a circle, but it's open. A circle's open, our mouth is open. We don't feel it close and make that strong push to make a line like a B does. So what our mouth does and tells us can give us very strong cues and support as we're either trying to make the sound as we see it or write the letter for the sound that we hear in a word. So B, we draw a line and then we open up. So ba. D, we keep our mouth open and it doesn't close. We never see that line. We're going to write it when we finish it, but duh. So that's our difference between B's and D's. We can use our lips, use our mouth to feel what it's doing. Now, B and P are made the exact same way with our mouth. If you watch my mouth, it's going to look the same. They are complementary pairs. It's their productions and how they do it that make them go together. So, ba. Looks exactly the same because our mouth does the exact same thing. The only difference is whether or not we use our voice. So the difference between them is the voicing. With a B, we turn on our voice and you hear the sound. With a P, you can whisper it. You don't use any voice. Listen again. So, ba. So what I like to do with this to show the difference is our light switch. If a B is made, our voice is turned on. So the line goes up, just like our light switch goes up. Here's our B. We've got our line first because our lips made our line, and the line goes up, just like the on-off switch. Now, if we take a P, same thing, our line is first, but our voice is turned off. So the line goes down. So that is how we can pull in these other components. Now, Q, again, is made very similar to a D. Now, this is where it gets a little bit tricky because Q makes qua, but it makes the wa sound with it because there's a U after it. Q and U stick like glue. You will not see a word in English that is a Q without a U. So that's how you get that wa sound. But so essentially a Q makes a K sound. My husband's outside the window waving at me, so I apologize. Okay. So, but D and Q are also very similar because we do similar things with our mouth again. So, duh and k. Our mouth stays the same on the outside. We see the same thing. It's open, like the circle. The only difference is whether we turn on our voice for duh, so the line goes up, or we turn, or our voice is off for k, the line goes down. So we can use our mouth first to determine what do we see first, a line or a circle. Duh. So what comes first, the line or the circle? And then you fill in with the rest. Now P's and Q's, or P versus Q, B versus P, then we can use the on-off switch to determine, do you hear your voice? Could you whisper it if you wanted to? You can't whisper a B. You can't, no matter how hard you try, you're not going to get a whisper if you're actually making that sound. P, you can't turn it on unless you're adding other sounds to it. So your on-off switch is going to help you know what direction it goes. So then you can play around with looking for, okay, do you see the line first or the circle first? What do you see? What do you feel? And playing that back and forth. And that's a way that can really help your kiddos. Now, people often say, I've heard it said that it's just 4 letters. We can often use the rest of the word to kind of make it up. It's not that important to really put a lot of emphasis here. But I've seen some kiddos where they get so stuck because this is so hard for them and they can't figure it out. But by the time they've either worked on this or decided it's not worth it, they're just going to guess. They can't figure out the word is. Especially if you think about the word pig, big, dig. The rest of the word's not going to help them. It's all the same. So it all depends which direction it's turned or facing. So that's where those cues can come in to help. Now, letter sound awareness, the biggest part behind that is really helping your kiddo realize and recognize what sounds they hear, what letters it can go with. For decoding, I like this as a visual tool if it's helpful for kiddos. I don't find it to be helpful for everybody, but it can be helpful. So I call it the tap, loop, and slide. So say you have your word cat. You can start out with the circles to tap it out. So k, a, t. That really draws kiddos' awareness to the letter that they see, especially if they're good at sliding through guessing or not paying attention to every piece in the word. The tap helps draw their attention to it and makes them focus all the way to the end. Often kiddos are really good at learning some of those compensatory strategies where they pick up on the first letter or a couple letters and then they just guess the rest of it because it's something that would start that way and it sounds the same. So the tap can be helpful to attend to all of that. Then they loop those sounds together. So k, at, now we loop it, cat, and then we slide it, cat. So I just like this as a visual for kiddos to help kind of put all those pieces together. Because if we just stop with the tapping, k, at, kiddos might know the sounds in the word, but they might not know the word and they haven't necessarily pulled it all together to get the meaning. And that's what we really need as the ultimate effect to read. A couple of other pieces I wanted to touch on. So fluency, there are 3 parts to fluency. Accuracy, rate, and prosody, which is kind of intonation, how our voice sounds, kind of how we do the ups and the downs, the flow and the rhythm. Unfortunately, there's often too big of an emphasis on rate and not enough on the other components. I want the focus initially to always, always, always be on accuracy. If a kiddo's not reading the word correctly off the page, who cares how fast they're reading it? So, and often what I find is that I often have to undo a lot of work that's been done to gain fluency by getting kiddos to slow down. It's been drilled into them. They need to read fast as you can. Take this passage, read it as fast as you can. You have a minute to do it. That's what they hear day in and day out. I don't want them doing that. I want them to get all the words right. Once you get every word right on this page, then we can try and make it go faster. But typically, if they're getting the words right, they're not guessing as much. They don't have as much of that back and forth trying to figure it out and piece it together. So we often see the rate increase. But if we're ever going to try and work on getting it to go a little bit faster, I don't ever like to use the word read fast. I like to say read smooth. Because if a child is reading smoothly, it's going to flow and the rate is going to increase. And they don't have that pressure to read fast. Comprehension is a big beast in and of itself. There's a lot that goes into understanding what you read. Often, though, if a child is understanding and getting the word off the page accurately, the comprehension improves. But if it's not improving, or if you want to address that, there's a lot that goes into it. I love this website here from readingrockets.org. It has a really great article that goes into a lot of strategies that you can use to address comprehension more directly. So there's resources kind of interspersed throughout, but I would say the 4 takeaway resources that I think are very worthwhile initially is the Decoding Dyslexia Idaho website. There's a lot of great resources there, including local resources for professionals in the area. Understood.org and readingrockets.org. Understood.org is more specific to learning disabilities and learning challenges in general. So there's a lot about all of the different diagnoses I put on that initial page, but it also does incorporate a lot as in terms of dyslexia. Reading Rockets is specific to reading. But you could spend days perusing these 2 websites and come out with a ton of really great information. I always find that I get on there to read an article that I've pulled up and then some of their suggested articles, I'm like, oh, that's next. Okay. And I find myself having to pull myself away because there's some really great stuff on there. And then the book, the Dyslexia Empowerment Plan by Ben Foss is a really great book. It follows a lot of what this presentation goes into of how do we empower our children and our students and how do we set them up for success? And so it talks really specifically about strategies, tools, and supports that you have available to you and gives some really great specifics. And so can help kind of set that framework. So I have spoke right up to the minute. I apologize, but does anybody have any questions?
Thank you, Kirsten. Really great information. Is there any questions? I don't have any in the chat box, but you're all welcome to unmute yourself and ask any questions you may have. Maybe we'll just take a couple minutes to do that.
I did see one thing as I pull up SLD, or is it called SLD? Yes, specific learning disabilities. So that is an IDA I think that is more specific to the IDA. You often hear that kind of interchangeably, SLI, SLD, whether you're using impairment or disability. But yes, I think that is more specific to the IDA terminology that you would find the specific learning disability.
Well, if we don't have any questions, this was recorded and we will be sending out the recording. Kirsten, will we be able to attach your presentation slide?
Absolutely.
Really great information there. So we'll be sending that out to those that attended today and those that have registered to attend to watch it later. I don't see any questions being posted. So I just want to mention that for the parents that are out there or the specialists that have parents that are feeling overwhelmed by the process within the public school system, it is a process. And there's a lot of rights that parents actually do have that you may not be aware of. I myself have been a parent on a long journey for nearly 10 years now with my own son. So I do act as an advocate in supporting parents through the process in our Idaho public schools. You can reach out to me directly, and I'm happy to review your IEP and help you gain some tools on how to advocate for what is best for your kiddo, and also to write appropriate goals for students with dyslexia. So you can find me at Robin, ROBIN, at decodingdyslexiaidaho.org. I love supporting families. I, as a mom myself, never enjoyed attending those IEP meetings alone, and I don't think anyone should. So I'm here to support you, and we also have other members of our team that are here to support you. So that also goes for specialists that work with kiddos that aren't necessarily familiar with the public education system and that process of an IEP. Please do also reach out. We can help guide you as well. So Kirsten, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for attending and learning and growing. That's all I have. No more questions, and we will, oh, there's one hand that just raised. You can go ahead and unmute yourself. Or is that a clap? Maybe that's a clap. I think that was a clap. Okay. Thank you guys. We won't keep you any longer. Thank you so much for coming, and we hope to see you again at another webinar.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.